Michigan has two pieces. The Lower Peninsula is home to almost 10 million people. The Upper Peninsula holds only about 300,000. Same state, same flag, almost nothing else in common. So why does one of the most water-rich landscapes in North America have the population density of rural Wyoming? The answer explains why some places become centers of civilization, and why others never do. To understand why the Upper Peninsula is empty, you have to understand what it actually is. Not just a second piece of Michigan sitting above the Straits of Mackinac. A completely different kind of place. At first glance, it doesn't look like a place that should be empty at all. Lake Superior runs along the entire northern boundary. Lake Michigan and Lake Huron bracket the south. The UP is essentially a peninsula surrounded on three sides by the largest freshwater system on Earth. You can drive across it and never be more than about 50 miles from open water. Historically, places with this much water tend to attract people. Water supports transportation, it supports trade, it supports agriculture. Entire civilizations formed around having less of it than this. But the Upper Peninsula has a problem that isn't visible on a map. Beneath the forests, lakes, and shoreline sits the Canadian Shield. The bedrock here is between 1 and 2 billion years old. It's among the oldest exposed rock on Earth, and it helps explain why the UP never developed like the rest of the Midwest. The soil above it is thin and acidic. Glaciers scoured the landscape and left it irregular. Dense forests cover most of the interior. The winters are severe in ways most Americans don't encounter. The Keweenaw Peninsula pushes even farther north into Lake Superior than almost anywhere else in the contiguous United States. That's not just a geographic curiosity. It means the region sits deep inside the influence of a lake so large it creates its own weather. Lake Superior holds roughly 10% of the world's surface freshwater. It shapes temperatures, precipitation, and snowfall across the entire region. From November through April, the lake becomes a machine for generating winter. This is extreme geography, and it explains almost everything that follows. For a brief period, the Upper Peninsula had something valuable enough to overcome all of those disadvantages: copper. For most places, geography sets the rules, but every so often a resource becomes valuable enough to rewrite them. For a few decades, that's exactly what happened here. In the 1840s, geologists discovered something unusual in the Keweenaw Peninsula: native copper. Not copper ore that required extensive processing. Pure copper, embedded directly in the rock. The timing was ideal. Demand for copper was exploding. Telegraph networks were spreading across the country. Factories needed it. Militaries needed it. Industrial America was wiring itself together, and the Keweenaw sat on one of the richest copper deposits in the world. At its peak, the region produced somewhere between 75 and 80% of all copper mined in the United States. People went where the copper was. The clearest example was Calumet. Deep in the North Woods, far from major markets and surrounded by land that could never support large-scale agriculture, a city appeared anyway. Immigrants arrived from Cornwall, Finland, Croatia, and elsewhere across Europe. Hotels, department stores, opera houses, and banks followed. At its peak, Calumet reached roughly 25,000 people and became one of the wealthiest communities per capita in the country. For a few decades, copper overruled geography. But only for a few decades. The problem was that the geography never changed. The mines simply made it temporarily irrelevant. By the late 19th century, major copper deposits were being developed in Arizona and later in Chile. They were cheaper to extract, easier to scale, and closer to growing population centers. The economics shifted. The Keweenaw's mines became increasingly difficult to justify. The decline was gradual, then sudden. In 1913, during a bitter mining strike, someone yelled fire during a Christmas Eve gathering in Calumet's Italian Hall. There was no fire. In the stampede that followed, 73 people were killed, most of them children. The tragedy became one of the defining episodes of the American labor movement, but it also arrived at a moment when the industry's future was already in doubt. Within a few decades, most of the major mines had closed. Calumet fell from roughly 25,000 residents to fewer than 2,000. The people left because the economy that justified living there had moved somewhere else. But even that doesn't fully explain why the Upper Peninsula is so empty today. The copper boom was always geographically limited. It transformed parts of the Keweenaw Peninsula, but most of the UP never shared in that prosperity. Even at the height of the mining era, vast stretches of the region remained sparsely populated. To understand why, you have to go back to the geology itself. The easiest way to understand the Upper Peninsula is to compare it with the rest of the Midwest. States like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and much of Lower Michigan developed around an economic engine capable of supporting millions of people: agriculture. Productive farmland does more than feed a population. It creates surplus that supports towns. Towns justify roads, railroads, banks, and industry. Population attracts more population. Over time, the process becomes self-reinforcing. The UP never entered that cycle. Settlers arrived throughout the 19th century expecting to build farming communities similar to the ones spreading across the Midwest. In some places, they succeeded. Across most of the region, they didn't. There was never enough productive land to support the kind of broad settlement that transformed the states farther south. That distinction matters because agriculture and mining produce very different outcomes. A mine can make a town wealthy. Agriculture can populate an entire region. That's an important distinction. Mining can attract people to a place. Agriculture gives them a reason to stay, generation after generation. Even at the height of the copper boom, most of the Upper Peninsula remained sparsely settled. The mines created pockets of prosperity, but they never created a population base large enough to reshape the region as a whole. The climate reinforced that reality. Houghton, in the heart of the Keweenaw Peninsula, averages more than 200 inches of snowfall each year. Long winters shortened growing seasons, increased transportation costs, and made development more expensive than it was across much of the Midwest. Every road, building, and mile of infrastructure required more effort to maintain. Isolation compounded the problem. For much of its history, reaching the Upper Peninsula from Lower Michigan required crossing the Straits of Mackinac by ferry. Then the Mackinac Bridge finally opened in 1957 after 3 years of construction. At the time, it was the longest suspension bridge in the Western Hemisphere. The effort required to connect the UP to the rest of Michigan was extraordinary. But by then, the broader settlement pattern had already been established. The major population centers of the Midwest had developed elsewhere. So had the major transportation networks and most of the resulting investment. That's why the decline of copper isn't enough to explain the UP. The more important fact is that outside of mining, the region never developed the foundation that populated the rest of the Midwest. And that's the difference between a place that declined and a place that never fully developed in the first place. The Upper Peninsula belongs much more to the second category than the first. The Upper Peninsula wasn't emptied. For the most part, it never filled in. The Upper Peninsula's low population isn't just a demographic fact. It's the reason much of the region still looks the way it does. Large parts of the eastern United States were logged, developed, industrialized, or heavily altered over the last 2 centuries. The UP experienced some of that pressure, but far less than most comparable regions. What remained was extensive forest, abundant freshwater, and long stretches of shoreline that never accumulated large populations. For most of the 20th century, those weren't necessarily major advantages. Today, they look different. Geography doesn't change very quickly. What changes is what the economy values. The same characteristics that once limited growth can become assets under different conditions. Clean water is becoming more valuable. Undeveloped land is becoming more valuable. Places that offer access to both are becoming harder to find. That doesn't mean the UP is on the verge of another boom. The modern economy still runs into many of the same constraints that limited settlement in the first place. The region's most visible industrial opportunity is critical minerals. Eagle Mine, near Marquette, produces nickel used in electric vehicle batteries and other industrial applications. But it remains a single operation with a finite lifespan, not the foundation of a broader economic transformation. A smaller shift may be more interesting. For generations, people moved away from the Upper Peninsula because economic opportunity existed somewhere else. Remote work weakens that relationship. A software engineer, designer, or consultant no longer has to live near a major office to participate in the national economy. That doesn't remove the region's disadvantages. It changes which advantages matter. Someone looking for access to financial markets still benefits from living in New York. Someone looking for access to manufacturing networks still benefits from living near Chicago or Detroit. But someone whose job requires only an internet connection evaluates geography differently. For the first time in a long time, some people are choosing the Upper Peninsula rather than leaving it. Whether that becomes a meaningful trend is unclear. What is clear is that the characteristics that limited growth in the past helped preserve something increasingly uncommon. The UP never became one of the major population centers of North America. As a result, it retained forests, freshwater, and open space that much of the continent lost long ago. The region's future may not depend on overcoming its geography. It may depend on the rest of the economy finding new reasons to value it. The Upper Peninsula isn't empty because something went wrong. The mines closed, the economy changed, those things mattered, but they aren't the main reason the UP looks the way it does today. The more important fact is that the forces that populated most of the Midwest never fully took hold here. For a brief period, copper overcame the region's disadvantages. It created towns, attracted immigrants, and built remarkable communities in places that otherwise would have remained remote. But copper was an exception. The underlying geography never changed. The UP never developed the agricultural foundation that filled states like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Lower Michigan with millions of people. Outside of a few mining districts, it remained what it had always been, a heavily forested region at the edge of the Great Lakes. The place didn't fail. For the most part, it never filled in. The rock is still there. The lakes are still there. The winters are still there. The same geography that limited settlement also preserved something increasingly rare: vast forests, abundant freshwater, and open space on a scale that much of the Midwest lost long ago. And that's what makes the Upper Peninsula interesting. Not because it's a region waiting to become something else, because it never stopped being exactly what it was. If you want to understand the water system surrounding the UP, and why it may become one of the country's most valuable resources, the Great Lakes video covers that in full. I'll link it here. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it.